Picture a map of North America 500 years ago. The whole continent is home to hundreds of different peoples: Cherokee, Lakota, Navajo, Iroquois, Apache. There were no borders in the modern sense, but there were clear territories, trade routes, alliances, and wars between tribes. Now look at a map of the United States today. Native American reservations are small, often scattered islands of land, frequently in deserts or on unfertile ground, covering less than 2% of the country's territory. This despite the fact that indigenous peoples had lived on this continent for tens of thousands of years before a single European set foot on it. How did peoples who once owned an entire continent end up on scraps of land that the colonists themselves considered worthless? What is a reservation? Really, a refuge or a prison? And why hasn't the fight for native land ended, even today? Today we'll trace the path from the first treaties to the modern land-back movement and figure out what really happened to the lands of Native Americans. Before we talk about losing land, it's worth understanding what exactly was lost. By the time Europeans arrived, the territory of what is now the US and Canada was home to, according to various historians' estimates, anywhere from a few million to over 10 million people, belonging to hundreds of distinct nations and language groups. These were not primitive tribes in the simplified way pop culture has long portrayed them, but complex societies with their own politics, agriculture, trade, and diplomacy. Land wasn't owned by individuals in the European sense of property. Territory was most often treated as a shared resource of the people, a place for hunting, farming, and spiritual practice. This very difference in how land ownership was understood, land belongs to everyone and no one, versus land is a commodity that can be bought, sold, fenced off, would become one of the main sources of the tragedy we're about to cover. When the first colonists landed on the eastern coast, they made agreements with local nations, often unequal, often based on misunderstanding, because the very concept of selling land forever simply didn't exist in many tribal cultures. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, colonists gradually pushed deeper into the continent. After the United States was founded in 1776, the new nation inherited both the European practice of treaty-making with tribes and the European appetite for land. Formally, the American government recognized native nations as separate political entities. Treaties were signed with them the same way they would be with foreign states. Over the course of the 19th century, more than 350 such treaties were signed in total. But in practice, these treaties were systematically violated by the U.S. government itself. The moment fertile soil, gold, or simply a need for expansion was found on land guaranteed forever, the treaty went out the window. The classic pattern repeated itself again and again. The government signs a treaty recognizing land as belonging to a tribe forever. Settlers move onto that territory in defiance of the treaty. Conflict breaks out. The U.S. Army intervenes on the settlers' side, and after the conflict, a new treaty is signed, on worse terms for the native nation. And the cycle repeats. That a turning point came in 1830, when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This law gave the federal government the power to forcibly relocate native nations from their historic homelands in the southeast to territory west of the Mississippi River, where the state of Oklahoma is located today. Officially, the removal was supposed to be voluntary. In practice, it was coercion under the threat of military force. The most tragic episode was the removal of the Cherokee Nation during the winter of 1838 to 1839. The U.S. Army forcibly drove people from their homes, often without letting them take their belongings, and sent them on a months-long forced march of over 1,000 miles. People walked in the cold, without adequate food, medicine, or warm clothing. According to various estimates, between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee died during this journey, which became known in history as the Trail of Tears, roughly 1 in every 4 or 5 people who set out. Other southeastern nations suffered the same fate: the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. In total, around 100,000 people were forcibly removed during the 1830s. It's important to understand, the lands they were relocated to didn't remain untouched for long either. This was only the first act of a much longer tragedy. In the second half of the 19th century, with the expansion of the railroads and the gold rush, pressure on the lands of the Great Plains nations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, rose sharply. It was during this period that the concept of the reservation, as we know it today, finally took shape: a limited, clearly defined territory to which a tribe relocates, often by force, and which, according to the government's plan, it is no longer supposed to leave without permission. The logic was openly utilitarian. Reservations were mostly located on land that, at the time it was set aside, was considered poorly suited for white settlers' agriculture: arid, rocky, remote. Fertile land, pastures, and areas with mineral resources stayed outside reservation boundaries, or were carved out of them later, whenever something valuable was found there. A telling example is the Black Hills in the Dakotas, land sacred to the Lakota people, guaranteed to them forever under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. When gold was discovered there in 1874, the U.S. government unilaterally seized the land, treaty or no treaty. The U.S. Supreme Court, as far back as 1980, ruled this an illegal seizure and awarded the Lakota compensation, but the tribe still refuses to accept the money to this day, insisting on the return of the land itself rather than a payout. Resistance from native nations was suppressed by military force. This period culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre in December 1890, when U.S. soldiers killed between 150 and 300 unarmed Lakota, including women and children. This event is generally considered the symbolic end of armed native resistance on the Great Plains. By the end of the 19th century, virtually every surviving nation had been confined to a reservation under direct federal control, that you'd think that once reservations were established, the loss of land would have stopped. Instead, the opposite happened. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act. The stated goals sounded progressive: break up tribal communal land ownership into individual plots, usually 65 to 160 acres per family, in order to teach Indians farming and integrate them into American society as individual landowners. The real effect was different. After plots were allotted to families, the huge amount of surplus land left over within reservation boundaries was declared open and sold off to white settlers or transferred to government control. On top of that, many of the plots allotted to native families were sold off over the following decades, often under pressure from debt, fraud, or outright deception by land speculators, whom the law allowed to buy land from native allotees just a few years after allotment. The results are staggering. During the period the Dawes Act was in effect, from 1887 to 1934, the total area of land held by native nations shrank from roughly 138 million acres to about 48 million. In other words, reservations, land that had already been reduced to whatever was left over after centuries of displacement, lost nearly 2/3 of their remaining area. It wasn't until 1934, with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, that the policy of forced allotment was officially ended. But the damage done could no longer be undone. Losing land is only one part of the tragedy. Alongside it, another policy was underway, one aimed at destroying the cultural and linguistic identity of Native peoples itself. From the late 19th century until nearly the end of the 20th, a system of federal boarding schools for Native children operated in the U.S. and Canada. The motto of one such school, founded by Army officer Richard Pratt, put it bluntly: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children were taken from their families, often by force, forbidden from speaking their native language or practicing traditional customs, had their hair cut, and were dressed in uniforms. In many of these institutions, children suffered physical, psychological, and often sexual abuse. The exact number of children who died in these schools from disease, malnutrition, or mistreatment is still being determined by researchers and investigative commissions. In 2022, the U.S. Department of the Interior officially confirmed the existence of unmarked burial sites for children at former boarding school locations. This policy was directly connected to the land issue. Children raised outside their people's culture, without knowledge of their language or traditional practices of land stewardship, were far less equipped to defend their community's collective rights as adults. In the mid-20th century, in the 1950s, the U.S. federal government launched a new wave of policy, the so-called Termination Era. This time, the goal was to end official recognition of individual tribes as self-governing political entities altogether, dissolve the status of their reservations, and dissolve Native Americans into the general population of the country. During this period, more than 100 tribes lost their federal recognition status, which automatically meant losing federal-level protection over their lands and resources. At the same time, a relocation program encouraged Native people to move off reservations into big cities, ostensibly for jobs and a better life, but in reality to speed up assimilation and further empty out reservation land. The termination policy turned out to be so destructive and unpopular that by the 1960s and 70s the government officially abandoned it, shifting to the opposite course, the so-called self-determination era. But some of the tribes that lost recognition during this period fought for decades to get it back, and some still haven't. So, where does that leave us today? The U.S. has more than 570 federally recognized tribes and roughly 320 reservations. Altogether, these territories make up about 2% of the country's land area, all that remains of a continent that once belonged entirely to Native peoples. Living conditions on many reservations remain harsh. According to official statistics, poverty rates within reservations are several times higher than the national average. Unemployment is also significantly above average, and access to quality health care, clean water, and education is limited in many areas. Part of this is a direct continuation of the history we've covered. Reservations are mostly located on land poorly suited for agriculture or industry, and centuries of forced resource extraction left communities without an economic base for development. At the same time, significant mineral deposits, coal, uranium, oil, and gas, have been found on the territory of some reservations. This has created a new source of conflict. On one hand, extraction could bring income to communities. On the other, it has often been carried out by outside companies on unfavorable terms for tribes, causing serious environmental damage and harming sites sacred to Native peoples. One of the most high-profile examples of the past decade is the protest against construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 to 2017, when the Standing Rock Sioux Nation and thousands of activists from around the world opposed routing the pipeline near their reservation, citing the risk of contaminating drinking water sources and disturbing sacred burial sites that in recent years. A movement known as Land Back has been gaining momentum. This isn't a call to remove all non-native residents from the country, as critics sometimes mistakenly frame it, but a demand to return control over specific territories to native nations, national parks, sacred sites, land that is still legally held by the federal government despite being historically and spiritually tied to particular tribes. There have been real examples of success. In 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in McGirt v. Oklahoma that a significant portion of eastern Oklahoma legally remains Creek Nation reservation land, a decision with far-reaching consequences for jurisdiction in the region. Various states have also seen cases of voluntary land returned to tribes by state governments, private landowners, or conservation organizations. This is a slow and contested process, far from finished. But it shows that the question of native land isn't just a page in a history textbook. It's a living, current political issue today. To understand modern reservations, you need to understand a legal concept most people outside the U.S. have never heard of: tribal sovereignty. Federally recognized tribes in the United States are not simply ethnic minorities or landowners with a special deed. Legally, they are treated as domestic dependent nations, a phrase coined by the Supreme Court back in 1831 in the case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. That means tribal governments have many of the powers of an independent nation operating within a reservation's borders. Their own constitutions, their own courts, their own police forces, their own tax systems, and the authority to regulate their own membership and internal affairs. At the same time, this sovereignty is dependent. It exists at the discretion of the federal government, and Congress has, throughout history, unilaterally expanded or restricted it whenever it chose. This contradiction, nations that are sovereign, yet subordinate to a more powerful government that can override that sovereignty at will, sits at the heart of nearly every legal battle native nations have fought in the last century. This is why reservations today are, in some ways, genuinely different jurisdictions from the surrounding states. Traffic laws, criminal jurisdiction, business regulation, and gambling laws can all differ dramatically the moment you cross a reservation boundary. It's also why so many of the conflicts we've discussed over land, water, and resources end up being fought not just politically, but in federal court, case by case. Over more than 2 centuries, one of the most visible changes on many reservations since the late 20th century has been the rise of tribal casinos. Because reservations exist partly outside state jurisdiction, several tribes in the 1970s and 80s began opening bingo halls and card rooms that weren't subject to the stricter gambling laws of the states around them. States tried to shut these operations down, and the resulting legal fight reached the Supreme Court in 1987 in California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. The court ruled in the tribe's favor, affirming that states generally couldn't enforce their gambling restrictions on tribal land. Congress responded a year later with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988, which created a formal legal framework allowing tribes to operate casinos under negotiated agreements with state governments. What followed was an economic transformation unlike anything reservations had seen since the 19th century. Today, several hundred tribal gaming operations exist across the country, generating tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue combined. But it's important not to romanticize this as a simple success story. The benefits are wildly uneven. A small number of tribes, often those with reservations located near major population centers, built enormously profitable casino resorts and used the revenue to fund healthcare, education, and housing for their members. Many other tribes, especially those on remote, rural reservations far from any city, saw little or no benefit at all, because a casino in the middle of nowhere simply doesn't attract customers. For a majority of Native Americans living on reservations, casino wealth remains largely out of reach. Land wasn't the only resource stripped away, delayed, or contested. Water was too. And in the arid West, water has often mattered just as much as land itself. In 1908, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in Winters versus United States that would shape water law for the next century. The court held that when the federal government created a reservation, it implicitly reserved enough water rights to make that land usable, even if the treaty creating the reservation never mentioned water explicitly. This became known as the Winters Doctrine, and in theory it gave tribes some of the oldest and strongest water rights in the western United States, since their reservations often predated the states themselves. In practice, tribes have spent over a century fighting to actually see those water rights enforced. Rivers were dammed, water was diverted to non-native farms and growing cities, and many tribes found themselves with land, but without reliable access to the water needed to farm it or even to drink safely. Settling a single tribe's water rights claim in court or through negotiated federal settlement can take decades and cost tens of millions of dollars in legal fees, a burden many tribal governments can barely afford. Some of the most severe modern examples come from the Navajo Nation, the largest reservation in the country by land area, where a significant share of households still lack access to running water at all. A stark illustration of how a legal right on paper doesn't automatically translate into water in a kitchen tap. The story of native dispossession isn't only about land signed away in the 19th century. Two ongoing crises show how the same patterns of erasure and neglect persist into the present. The first is the continuing fight over Native children. Well into the 20th century, it was common practice for state child welfare systems to remove Native children from their families and place them with non-Native adoptive families or in non-Native foster care, often for reasons as vague as poverty, which courts and social workers frequently treated as evidence of parental unfitness. In response, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which gave tribes a formal say in custody and adoption proceedings involving their children. The law has been challenged repeatedly in court ever since, most recently reaching the Supreme Court in 2023, which upheld it, a rare and significant legal victory for tribal authority in the modern era. The second crisis is the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, often abbreviated MMIW. Native American women face rates of violence and disappearance far above the national average, and for decades, cases involving Native victims were investigated inconsistently, under-resourced, or simply never solved, a pattern many researchers link directly to the complicated, overlapping jurisdiction between tribal police, state police, and federal agencies on reservation land, a legal maze that criminals have often been able to exploit. In recent years, the issue has gained more national attention, leading to new federal task forces and legislation, but activists say the response still lags far behind the scale of the problem. Alongside the legal and economic battles, recent decades have also seen a quieter, but meaningful shift: the reclaiming of language, names, and public memory. Place names across the United States are slowly being changed back to indigenous names or corrected to remove openly racist terminology, including a 2021 decision by the U.S. Department of the Interior to replace a derogatory term for Native women that had been used in hundreds of place names across the country. Sports teams and mascots that once used caricatured Native imagery have faced years of pressure and, in several high-profile cases, changed their names entirely. Federal holidays have shifted too. A growing number of states and cities now observe Indigenous Peoples Day alongside or instead of Columbus Day. Language revitalization has become a priority for many tribal governments as well. Native languages that boarding schools spent a century trying to erase are now being taught in tribal-run schools, preserved in digital archives, and in some cases brought back from the edge of extinction through dedicated immersion programs, a direct, generational answer to the assimilation policies described earlier in this story. None of this undoes the land that was lost, but it reflects a broader shift from a policy environment historically aimed at making Native nations disappear to one, however imperfect and unevenly applied, that at least formally recognizes their right to exist, govern themselves, and define their own future. So where does all of this leave us? The land question that began with the first colonial treaties never really closed. It simply changed shape. It moved from open warfare to bureaucratic allotment, from allotment to termination, from termination to decades of courtroom battles over water, gaming, jurisdiction, and the custody of children. Each era's laws and policies claimed to solve the Indian problem once and for all. None of them did, because the underlying question, whose land is this and who gets to decide, was never actually settled. It was simply overridden again and again by whichever side held more power at the time. What's different today is that Native nations increasingly hold some of that power themselves, in courtrooms, in Congress, in state legislatures, and in their own tribal governments, which now run schools, hospitals, police departments, and, in some cases, billion-dollar gaming enterprises. The fight is far from over, and the numbers, 2% of the land, poverty rates several times the national average, water that still doesn't reach every home, make clear how much remains unresolved. But the story isn't only one of loss. It's also the story of hundreds of nations that were supposed to disappear by design and didn't. If there's one thing 5 centuries of broken treaties should teach us, it's that this is not a closed chapter of American history. It's a live, ongoing negotiation, and it's still being written. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments which part of this history surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one.